Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. We have a return to severe weather in the cards for the next few days as the SPC has outlined risk areas basically from tomorrow, Thursday, March 7th into Saturday, March 9th. So an active stretch of severe weather on tap for parts of the southern U.S. Starting tomorrow, once again, Thursday, March 7th, we have a slight risk, level 2 out of 5, that's been outlined from the far eastern Texas panhandle, western Oklahoma, southward into south central Texas. All hazards on the table with tomorrow's activity, most notably large hail. Large hail is going to be the greatest threat with these storms tomorrow. That 15% area does encompass that entire slight risk area, and that's really the reason for the slight risk. We also have a damaging wind threat, low-end damaging wind threat, as well as a low-end tornado risk, basically from the eastern Texas panhandle and western Oklahoma, southward through really the Abilene area of north central Texas. So all hazards on the table with tomorrow's activity, with the most notable threat going to be large hail. Then we move into Friday, March 8th, where we have, again, a large slight risk level 2 out of 5 area from southeast Oklahoma, eastern Texas, eastward through Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, into Alabama and the Florida Panhandle. Now, these outlook lines, there's still a bit of uncertainty with the forecast going forward, as you'll see as we go through the data here in just a little bit. So these outlook lines may shift a little bit over the coming days, but for now we have a broad slight risk area where we will most likely see the greatest threat for severe storms on Friday. All hazards on the table at this point. We'll go into that a little bit more as we go into the video. But for now, just a large slight risk area. And again, these outlook lines could change a little bit as we go through the next couple of days leading up to Friday. Then the threat continues into Saturday, March 9th. Small 15% risk area outlined for southern Alabama, southern Georgia, into the Florida Panhandle and northern Florida vicinity as the threat continues on into Saturday. In this video, we're going to focus on the Thursday-Friday time frame. Still quite a bit of uncertainty going forward into the Saturday time frame. We're going to have to see how Friday plays out before we can get a real judgment on Saturday. So we're going to focus on the Thursday-Friday time frame in this video. Going to go through a few different model forecasts. First, we'll take a look at some current observed data from what's going on right now in the atmosphere. And then we'll take a look at a few different models to kind of compare and contrast those and see what potential outcomes could come from this system. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's dive into some mesoanalysis data here, get a current picture of the environment. We'll start off at 500 millibars, as we always do, and you'll see not much going on across the continental U.S., a little bit of troughing here across the southeast coast, a little bit of a trough here across the northern plains, and this belt of strong flow you see coming into the bottom left portion of the image here, that is associated with this next trough that is coming in and will be our main player for our severe threat on the synoptic scale for this upcoming stretch of severe weather. You see a little bit of curvature there in the flow. Can't quite see out into the Pacific, but that is a trough that is coming in, and again, that will continue to march east over the next few days and provide the synoptic forcing for ascent that we need to get severe weather. Now, we're going to talk in a little bit about the timing of this trough, and it's a little bit off, especially for tomorrow's event, Thursday's event. And that's why the threat for daytime storms is a little bit up in the air, and we're going to have to rely on some other features, especially at the surface, to really get storms to go tomorrow during the daytime. So we'll talk about that here in a second. But for the Friday and Saturday time frame, we should have plenty of forcing with this trough moving east to provide for a severe threat in the Gulf Coast region. As you might expect, with the trough hanging back for now, we don't have much in the way of low-level cyclogenesis out here across the plains, and as we take a look at our surface map, you can see that that is the case. A little bit of a surface low here out across the Carolinas, a little bit of what appears to be some semblance of surface low associated with that northern stream trough there across the northern plains, but nothing really down here into the southern plains. We're going to see that start to change, though, as we go into tomorrow, especially during the afternoon and evening tomorrow. We'll start to see a little bit of cyclogenesis here as that trough inches closer and starts to traverse the higher terrain of the Rockies. We'll start to see that low-level cyclone develop out here across the eastern New Mexico, Texas Panhandle vicinity. Here's our current raw surface data, and you can see those 60s dew points are situated across northeast into south central and southeast Texas. Our 60s dew point line probably right in that region there. So 60s dew points relegated to the south of that line, and that's a good thing from a proximity standpoint for tomorrow's event, that we'll have 60s dew points closer to our area of interest. The problem is going to be the late ejection of the upper wave and the somewhat delayed initiation of low-level cyclogenesis. That's not going to allow those 60s dew points to really get pulled northward in time for our event tomorrow, at least during the daytime. As we go through the nighttime, as that surface low deepens, as the trough does finally eject, we will get pretty robust low-level moisture advection off to the north. But during the daytime, we're still probably going to see a little bit lower moisture than what would be typically considered adequate for robust severe weather here across the northern portion of the risk area, western Oklahoma into south central Kansas. We might still see mid 50s or so, mid to upper 50s dew points up there, which is certainly adequate for severe weather this time of year. But our best, most robust low-level moisture going to remain off to the south, probably across areas of Texas. And then for Friday, we won't have that problem, as we'll have that surface low moving off to the east. We'll have had plenty of time to get those 60s dew points northward, and we'll have a rich, broad, warm sector for Friday's event. But for tomorrow's event, especially during the daytime, we may have a little bit of difficulty getting these 60s dew points up to the north in time for initiation tomorrow afternoon. Let's move on to some soundings, and another potential issue with the moisture is its quality. Here's our morning sounding this morning at 12Z from Corpus Christi, so far south Texas. And you'll notice that we have a 67/66 profile there at the surface, but that moisture does not extend up into the atmosphere very far at all. Very, very shallow moist layer here beneath a stout elevated mixed layer at Corpus Christi. And we've talked about this many times before on the channel, that a shallow moist layer is often problematic in allowing storms to sustain themselves in a given environment. Lots of dry air can get ingested into developing updrafts with a shallow moist layer, and that can allow for some problems in allowing them to mature and sustain themselves in that environment. So that could be a problem. Where we see the better moisture tomorrow, we still could have that moisture be fairly shallow, and with a lot of dry air aloft, that could lead to some problems, especially in the daytime before we get that full moistening of the profile and that full advection of the better moisture northward into tomorrow evening, overnight into Friday morning. But for our daytime event tomorrow, we could be seeing some shallow moisture profiles for the area across the slight risk region. But we are expecting some moistening as we go into the day tomorrow, so we should see some negating of this dry air, at least a little bit. So that should help things a little bit. Even to the south at Brownsville this morning, we do have a little bit deeper of a moist layer, but still not very deep at all. But we still should see some semblance of moistening through the profile tomorrow as we go into the afternoon for tomorrow's event. All right, let's dive into some model data. As always, we're going to look at three different models: the 12Z NAM, the 12Z GFS, and the 6Z Euro. As I'm recording this, the 12Z Euro isn't quite out yet, so the 6Z run will do for our purposes. We'll start off with the 12Z NAM at 500 millibars, and here is our trough, situated across the southern California coast. Strong belt of flow rounding the base of that trough, and that trough will make its way off to the east over the next day or so, putting a nice belt of southwesterly flow across the southern U.S., mostly across Texas, a little bit into Oklahoma as well, but the stronger flow will remain relegated to the south and southwest of the region. Still plenty of stronger flow aloft to support strong deep layer shear for a severe storm threat tomorrow. Now, this is at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time tomorrow on the NAM, and if we draw out some features of the geometry of the trough, here's our axis of the trough, jet streak in here, fairly straight jet streak. You'll notice where we are within this jet streak. If we were to draw our conceptual quadrant model, we like to be in that left exit region of the jet streak. Well, that left exit region is lagging a little bit farther back here across West Texas. And as we know, our target area, or area of interest for tomorrow's severe weather event, is across western Oklahoma into much of the north central Texas vicinity. So especially with northern extent, we're a little bit removed from the main forcing with this trough. As we keep saying, the trough is a little bit delayed as far as the timing goes. As we go into the late afternoon and early evening hours, we'll start to see that exit region move in, start to get a little bit better forcing out across this region for a more widespread severe threat. But earlier on during the day, we're a little bit removed from the main forcing associated with this trough, and therefore we're going to have to rely on a lot of surface features to allow for storm initiation during the daytime. Again, during the evening hours and overnight hours, that trough will move in, we'll have nice forcing for ascent, and we'll have a much more widespread severe threat develop into the early morning hours on Friday. But as far as the daytime threat goes, that's why it's a little bit on the conditional side, and we're going to have to look at our low-level features to tell us if we're going to see any storm initiation during the day across the slight risk area tomorrow. But here's our trough, continues to move off to the east going into Friday, and we have this trough moving east with a pretty interesting configuration, a little bit of a positive tilt nature to this trough, with perhaps a little bit of a lead negatively tilted shortwave out here across North Texas into southern Oklahoma. Out ahead of that could be where a focus for a greater severe risk may develop. We'll take a look a little bit more deeply at this as we go into the latter portion of the video. But focusing on Thursday for now, a little bit of concern over the lack, or at least nebulous forcing for ascent across the slight risk area, especially with northward extent going into the day tomorrow. Let's go to the GFS now, see how the GFS progresses this upper trough. So again, there's our trough, moves off to the east going into the day. Here we are at 21Z. Much of the same. Jet streak still relegated well back to the southwest. Not a ton of forcing across this region. Maybe a little bit of a shortwave here. A little bit of ripples, rippliness in the flow, if you will, out across the Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma vicinity. So that could help things out. We'll go down to 700 millibars here in a second. But overall, we should maintain fairly weak synoptic scale forcing for ascent with northward extent going into tomorrow. Pretty similar picture to what the NAM was showing here on the GFS. Here is the European model, 6Z Euro. Same idea here. Trough maintains a fairly low amplitude going into the afternoon tomorrow. Perhaps slightly more progressive with the jet streak, not a ton, still lacking a little bit of forcing with northward extent. We do have a little bit of stronger flow here aloft out of the southwest across Oklahoma, which could be enough support itself. And we saw that on the other models as well. A little bit of a belt of stronger flow. That can be enough to initiate storms sometimes in these environments. But especially with southern extent, the forcing should be a little bit stronger, especially as we go into the overnight hours, in which we should, again, get that larger, more widespread severe threat to develop. So overall, for tomorrow's threat, the 500 millibar pattern looks fairly similar among all of the models. There's the European, the GFS, and the NAM. So pretty much on point among the models, pretty good agreement among the models for the positioning of the trough going into Thursday afternoon. Let's go down to the surface now. 12Z NAM at the surface. So once again, given a little bit of delay in the trough ejection, we probably won't see that surface low really start to tighten across the southern high plains until Thursday afternoon. And that's exactly what we see on the NAM. We start to see some semblance of broad low-level cyclogenesis out here across the southern high plains going into the morning hours tomorrow, but it's very broad, fairly weak. And then by early afternoon, we start to see that surface low tighten out here. A little bit of more closed contours there across the eastern New Mexico, western Texas Panhandle vicinity. This is at 1 p.m., that is at noon, 3 p.m., and going toward 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. Nice tight surface low out there across the Texas Panhandle. Not a whole lot of eastward progression with that surface low until the overnight hours into Friday morning. We'll zoom in here a little bit on the NAM, and you can see, once again, we'll go back a little bit, weak cyclogenesis here going into the morning, and then a nice tightening of that surface low going into the afternoon. Fairly strong surface convergence out here across that western Oklahoma vicinity, so that could be help overcome the somewhat nebulous forcing for ascent on the synoptic scale. A little bit of stronger convergence along that dry line, some warmer temperatures working their way in here. Fairly well mixed behind the dry line. We'll take a look at that in a second. But that dry line could be a conditional focus for storm development during the day tomorrow. Here's the GFS. We'll go down to the surface once again, and we'll back things up here to the initiation. So here's what the GFS is showing for the surface low. A little bit of broad cyclogenesis here going into the morning hours, and then we start to see that tightening of the surface low, very similar to the NAM, about 18Z, 21Z, 0Z. So fairly similar progression of the surface low among the GFS and the NAM. Pretty strong convergence there along the dry line. Southwesterly flow almost across the Texas Panhandle, more southeasterly flow there across the southern Oklahoma vicinity into northwest Texas. So that is pretty strong convergence there along the dry line. So that could help initiate a few storms there along the dry line tomorrow afternoon if that strong convergence is able to develop. But fairly nice surface low there, pretty classic situation, fairly similar positioning with that surface low. So all in all, the models seem to be pretty locked in on this solution. We'll take a look at the European model here, and we'll just go ahead and zoom in right away. So here we go. Surface low develops there into the morning. And the European model definitely on the weaker end of the guidance. A little bit broader of a surface low with the European model, a little bit more veered low-level flow out here, not quite as strong surface convergence or not quite as tight of a dry line. Much farther eastward progression of that dry line, it seems, or your dry line might be somewhere in here. So a little bit farther into west central Oklahoma than the other couple of models. We don't have moisture on here, but we can look at our theta E axis. So our dry line would be probably somewhere in here on the European model. Looking at the GFS, probably somewhere in here, a little bit different configuration to the dry line. And then on the NAM, dry line looks to be maybe out somewhere here in the western Texas Panhandle. So we are seeing some positioning differences with the overall dry line. We'll take a look at the moisture here on the NAM and GFS in a second. But we do still have a little bit of model discrepancy, at least with the intensity and positioning of the surface low and the associated surface features. With NAM and GFS on board with a very similar solution, I tend to discount the European model just a little bit. That doesn't seem all that accurate. It seems like we would start to see pretty strong low-level cyclogenesis out here across this area of eastern New Mexico and to the Texas Panhandle, instead of this broad, kind of strung-out surface low. So I'm going to side with the NAM and GFS here at this point, given that we have good model agreement among those two models. European model might be a little bit out to lunch in that regard. Let's look at the moisture here. We'll stay zoomed in on our Southern Plains sector. Here is the NAM moisture. So 12Z this morning as the model was initialized. Nice 60s dew point plume out there across southern Texas. Then as we go into the day today, this is at 18Z, those 60s dew points. We already saw those 60s dew points here as we're recording this video, 15, 16Z, all the way up here into northeast Texas. So that could be a little bit of a change between the model and the observed data, that we have a little bit better moisture return already up into parts of northeast Texas. So that could be something to watch as we go into tomorrow. But the overall progression of the moisture is we're going to try to get those 60s dew points off to the northwest as that surface low starts to at least broadly develop going into the overnight hours and into the morning hours tomorrow. 60s dew points try to make their way north of the Red River. And here we are by 21Z tomorrow. Pretty stout looking triple point there. Surface low somewhere out in here. Dry line in here, our moisture gradient, very dry air behind the dry line, moist air. NAM does have the 60s dew points up here into central Oklahoma by 3 p.m. with what appears to be some sort of frontal boundary, warm front. Cold front will be crashing at this time coming from the north, but our warm frontal zone looks to be somewhere in there. And so upper 50s dew points here would be certainly adequate for severe weather. This time of year, we don't need those 60s, upper 60s into 70s dew points for severe weather. NAM does try to maintain some semblance of 60s dew points out here across west central Oklahoma. And so we could see a couple of different foci for storm development here along the dry line. Could be this triple point warm front dry line intersection where convergence may be strongest, depending on the overall convergence along the dry line to the south. Could be a favored area as well if we get a little bit more southwesterly flow on the backside of the dry line, a little bit more southeasterly flow ahead of the dry line. Could be some strong convergence along the dry line itself. And we could have the warm frontal zone be a focus as well for a few storms. Weaker deep layer shear with northward extent, so storms with northward extent maybe have a little bit more tendency to be more multicellular in nature. We'll take a look at some soundings here in a second, but deep layer shear should be strong enough for supercells along the dry line here across northwest Oklahoma down to the south into northwest Texas. So let's go ahead and take a look at the GFS here. We'll take a look at the GFS moisture here. So GFS, much of the same, tries to get those 60s dew points. Really doesn't look all that favorable. Tries to mix out a lot of these dew points here this afternoon. We'll see if that is the case. Not sure if that is going to be the case this afternoon, but you'll see that moisture, very 60s dew point plume, kind of fragmented there across Texas, and we really don't get robust moisture at all across to the east of the dry line. Here's our dry line somewhere in that vicinity there. Warm frontal zone, if we were to go back to our surface observations there, warm frontal zone would be situated across south central Kansas, so somewhere in this vicinity here, with the surface low back out in this vicinity to the west. So we do have a broad area of warm sector, but very much lower dew points than what the NAM was showing. Right around the mid-50s dew points there across Oklahoma. 60s dew points remain relegated off to north central Texas and areas south. So big difference in the moisture here as far as between the NAM and the GFS. So that is certainly interesting to note. The NAM does tend to undermix a little bit, meaning that we've talked about vertical mixing before. When you get strong surface heating, that tends to bring a little bit, that allows air to rise off the surface, but also brings down a little bit drier air from aloft down to the surface, and that can help those dew points mix out a little bit going into the afternoon. We will have strong moisture advection out here ahead of the surface low, so I think that would offset vertical mixing somewhat. But we do see 4 or 5 degree dew point differences here across the area east of the dry line there in western Oklahoma. So that will be something to watch as we go into the afternoon. Given that we have 60s dew points already across parts of north central Texas, I might be inclined to believe the NAM a little bit more, that we're going to be able to get upper 50s dew points at least across western Oklahoma. Again, vertical mixing may be offset by strong warm advection ahead of the surface low and dry line. So we'll have to watch that for sure, but I might tend to side with the NAM at this point. GFS looks a little bit too on the low end as far as moisture goes. But let's take a couple of soundings. We'll go forward a little bit here on the NAM 0Z. We start to get those 60s dew points really up into Oklahoma before that cold front starts to crash. The surface low moves off to the east, and a wide warm sector for Friday. We'll come back to Friday here in just a second. But back here, we'll take a look. I wanted to take a look at, because dryline initiation might be a little bit on the conditional side, and we'll have to rely on that dryline circulation to get storms to go. Let's take a look at the depth of that dryline circulation, whether or not we'll be a little bit more likely to see storms in the lack of strong large-scale forcing for ascent. So the way that we do this is we want to take a sounding behind the dryline and one ahead of the dryline in the warm sector. First step here is to denote our mixed layer to the west of the dry line. So mixed layer, you can see here very well mixed air, that kind of inverted V profile here. And we're just looking to estimate the depth of the mixed layer here. We see the dew point kind of staying steady there until about this point. It starts to veer off to the left, meaning drier air. So our mixed layer might extend somewhere up in this vicinity here, just below 700 millibars. So if we were to now look, and I'm going to draw that in once again here just with the arrow so we can compare it to our sounding ahead of the dry line. So here's a sounding in the warm sector. This is at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. And so here is our moist layer. I'm going to use blue here to denote the moist layer, but our moist layer, 68 over 60 at the surface here to the east of the dry line. Moist layer still fairly shallow, a little bit of dry air aloft there, but here is our moist layer. So our dry line circulation looks to be something like this. And we want to compare that depth of the dry line circulation to where our level of free convection is, our LFC. And our LFC is right in here, according to this sounding. That LFC is well within the dry line circulation here. So that does give us a hint that the dry line may be more than able to initiate storms in this environment. If the LFC were a little bit higher than the dry line circulation, then we might not have a deep enough dry line circulation to initiate storms. But because the LFC is within the level of free convection, which is, as a quick review, is the point at which parcels can start to rise on their own above the LCL. And so as you can see that is well within the dry line circulation, so that our dry line tomorrow may be fairly good at initiating storms. And so we could be able to overcome that somewhat nebulous forcing for ascent, given that we have a fairly deep dry line circulation and the LFC well within that dry line circulation. Another thing we want to look for, and this again varies, the orientation of the dry line varies among the models, but we want to make sure that our low level flow is somewhat parallel to the dry line, as that allows our initiating updrafts to remain in that zone of ascent along the dry line for a little bit longer and allow them to mature before they begin to move off and away from that zone of ascent along the dry line. So let's go ahead and look at our 850 millibar winds. So our dry line looks something like that, 850 millibar winds out of the south-southeast, fairly parallel to that dry line. If we look at our 700 millibar winds, we see a little bit more perpendicularity between the dry line, especially with northward extent, a little bit better parallel nature to those wind vectors at 700 millibars to the south. So overall, it looks like we have a decent chance, our low-level winds fairly decently parallel that dry line, especially across western to southwest Oklahoma into northwest Texas. On the NAM run here, keep in mind that this is the NAM showing a little bit different orientation than the GFS. If we were to take the NAM here at face value, looks like we have a decent amount of parallelness with those winds in the low to mid levels there, allowing those updrafts to stay within that zone of ascent a little bit longer, allowing for a little bit greater potential for storm initiation, maybe a storm or two here along the dry line given nebulous large-scale forcing for ascent in the afternoon tomorrow. So that's just one. That's how you kind of can assess the ability for a dry line to initiate storms in a given environment. But let's go back, take a look at some soundings here. Again, we'll take one just ahead of the dry line. We'll take a couple down here. This will be from right ahead of the dry line, a little bit ahead of the triple point there in northern Oklahoma. Then we'll take one down here in northwest Texas. So this is our main dry line sounding. A little bit capped here, a little bit of a shallow moist layer. Once again, a little bit of that drier air remaining in place through much of the day tomorrow, as we saw on our morning sounding from Corpus Christi this morning. Decent instability, however, approaching 1,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer Cape. Strong deep layer shear for supercells, bulk shear approaching 50 knots, long-looking hodographs there. Very minimal curvature to start off with in the low levels of the hodograph. Low-level shear somewhat muted at this point, given a fairly weak low-level jet at this point. So that could mean more of a large hail threat with storms that fire along the dry line. Here we are along the triple point. A little bit deeper moisture with northward extents, somewhat surprisingly there, but somewhat similar to areas farther south. Decent instability up there along the triple point. Same thing, limited low-level shear, strong deep layer shear for supercells. So this looks very much like a hail type of environment, at least early on in this event. Down in northwest Texas, instability a little bit better with that stronger low-level moisture, stronger surface temperatures, and also keep in mind the NAM, as we talked about before, does tend to have a cool bias, temperatures in the 60s. Here across Oklahoma ahead of the dry line. Do think that's going to be a little bit on the low side. Temperatures should probably get into the 70s, especially with some clearing out ahead of the dry line. So keep that in mind. That could lead to a little bit more robust instability and a little bit less influence from this lingering dry air and capping there in the low levels. But here to the south, temperatures warmer, moisture a little bit higher, stronger instability, but definitely a shear profile that favors more hail-producing supercells than anything tornadic, at least early on in the environment. These are all at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time, 21Z tomorrow. Moving on to 0Z, so 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. We'll take another one here ahead of the triple point. Actually, let me get a little bit farther north, closer to the warm front. And then we'll take one down here to the south in west central Oklahoma, just to see here what we're going to be looking at. We do see a little bit of increase in low-level curvature here, 64 over 58 at 6 p.m. tomorrow. So again, that might be a little bit on the low side at this point. But we could see an increase in maybe a threat for a tornado or two with any sustained supercells that can maintain themselves in this environment. Again, we could be seeing a little bit of a cool bias here. But if any storm can become robust along the dry line, definitely would be supercellular given strong deep layer shear, and certainly a discrete mode given fairly nice shear vector orientation with respect to the initiating boundary. Let's take a look at that real quick. Here is our dry line. We'll draw that in right there. Shear vectors. Going to look something like this. Nice perpendicularity with those shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary, the dry line. So would certainly be discrete, especially with a little bit weaker large scale forcing for ascent. So that is definitely a positive if we can get this solution to come to fruition. Nice little bit of curve, a little bit of an increase in curvature there in the low levels. Could be a chance for a tornado or two with any sustained supercells, but I think mostly a large hail threat with this environment. And then the GFS, again, I tend to discount this moisture out ahead of the dry line a little bit. We'll take a sounding out here just ahead of the dry line, just to give you an idea of what the profiles might look like on the GFS. Much of the same as the NAM. Here, this is at 0Z on the GFS. Decent instability, nice low-level shear, over 200 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity, even with a somewhat weak low-level jet, but still strong deep layer shear for supercells. I would expect to see maybe a little bit higher moisture than this, 58, 59 possibly, but we'll have to just wait and see about that. But overall, pretty similar look to what the NAM was showing, so pretty locked in with tomorrow's setup that we could see. During the daytime, threat is again very conditional along the dry line. We could have again several different focal points for initiation. Could have one here along the triple point, a little bit farther south along the actual dry line itself, even farther south into West Texas where the forcing is going to be a little bit stronger. And then we should see going into the overnight hours that moisture will continue to creep northward. Dry line will start to surge east a little bit as the trough finally moves in, and at that point we should see a an increase in the coverage of storms here, especially across southern portions of the risk area, across central into north central Texas into Oklahoma. We'll probably see an increase in coverage of storms out here. Storms may tend to be elevated going into the overnight hours, even with moisture return out ahead of the dry line. So we probably will see a tendency for elevated storms here overnight. A little bit of cooling there in the low levels. Not much, though. We do see some curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph, so we could see a tendency for some surface-based storms to remain going into the morning hours on Friday before our event on Friday afternoon. Let's go ahead and take a look now at Friday afternoon. I'm going to back out to our upper air map here, our zoomed out view. So that trough is going to continue to make its way east, maintain its somewhat positive tilt going into Friday. And as we talked about before, it looks to be mainly mostly a positively tilted trough with what could be a little bit of a negatively tilted shortwave out ahead on the leading edge of the overall trough itself. So that could be a focus area for a little bit better severe intensity and coverage of severe storms here across far southeast Oklahoma, northeast Texas, into the Arklatex region, basically into northern Louisiana. Right ahead of the jet streak there, strong belt of flow maintains itself going into Friday. This is at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time on Friday, by the way. Let's take a look at how the GFS handles this trough going into Friday. So we'll back it up here a little bit. And here we go into Friday, and we see very similar solution to what the NAM was showing. Positively tilted trough moving into the southern U.S., negatively tilted shortwave out here out ahead on the leading edge of this trough, and nice belt of stronger flow overspreading the Gulf Coast region for Friday's event. So that is pretty interesting there, that the GFS and NAM are pretty locked in. We'll go to the European model now and see how it handles the trough. Let me zoom out to our CONUS sector. So here we go into Friday, and much of the same, little bit different configuration to this trough on the European model. It does appear that we may have a little bit of a shortwave as well on the leading edge, but a little bit different configuration from what we were seeing on the GFS and the NAM, although the overall story looks to be pretty much the same among the three models. Just a little bit of difference in timing and overall geometry of the trough, but overall, the idea is that a positively tilted trough with perhaps a lead negatively tilted shortwave will be making its way into the southern U.S., East Texas, and areas eastward going into the afternoon on Friday. Let's take a look at the surface low, how that will progress into Friday. We'll take a look at the NAM here. I'm going to zoom into our Southern Plains sector here. So here we go into Thursday. We get that cyclogenesis there across the Texas Panhandle going into Thursday afternoon. And then finally, as the forcing moves in, as the trough finally makes its way into the Southern Plains, we'll start to see that surface low move off to the east, perhaps consolidate a little bit as we get a little bit better kinematics aloft here for a surface low located somewhere near the Arklatex vicinity by the afternoon on Friday. This is at 3 p.m. This is at 6 p.m. So our surface low situated right here along the Red River. We'll have a nice warm sector out ahead of it. Cold front / dry line back in this vicinity here. Warm front looks to be up in here, and the warm frontal location, warm front looks to be maybe somewhere, a little bit hard to tell, could be somewhere up in here. But that is going to, the northward extent of the moisture, where the warm front is going to be situated, is all going to depend on convection Friday morning. So we are going to probably see convection persist into Friday morning from Thursday evening. Once again, we said we'll have an increase in the widespread nature of convection here going into Friday morning. That is going to modulate how far north the best moisture is going to get. If we see a lot more convection here across north central Texas into the Arklatex, then that warm front will be shunted south a little bit, and our severe threat as a result will be shunted a little bit farther south. If we don't have as much convection or less intense convection going into Friday morning, that will allow the warm front to shift northward a little bit more, perhaps into areas of western Oklahoma, north central to central Arkansas. We're still not quite sure about how that is going to progress. We're going to have to wait and see how Thursday progresses into Friday morning to know where our exact severe threat is going to be. But right now, our surface low right there along the Red River, with a warm front draped there across north central Arkansas down into Mississippi, with a pretty broad warm sector out ahead of it. Rich moisture out ahead of the dryline / cold front located right in here. 60s into 70s dew points, especially down there along the coast. So a broad area of a broad warm sector here to support severe storm development going into the afternoon on Friday. Here's the GFS. We did remember some differences in the moisture for Thursday's event. So we'll see how that is looking on Friday. So you see here, we'll start Thursday morning, those 60s dew points here. Again, I'm not really buying that we won't get at least upper 50s dew points up here in Oklahoma tomorrow. So that might be reason to discount the GFS just a little bit. But notice here, on Friday, this is at 21Z, just like the NAM, and we were seeing a vastly different solution here. Surface low, probably located somewhere right in here. So surface low looks to be somewhere right along the Red River, south central Oklahoma. But our surface boundary is much, much different. Dry line / cold front in this vicinity here. Warm front shunted well to the south. So the GFS is probably progging a lot more convection here across Oklahoma into Arkansas, shunting that warm sector south a little bit. Compare that to the NAM, and you see we have a vastly different solution here. So that is of a little bit of concern as far as forecast confidence here at this point in the forecast process. And that's why we're still seeing just a broad slight risk at this point. We could see some increase in probabilities for more localized areas and some shifting of the outlook lines. We'll probably see some shifting of the outlook lines as it becomes more clear going into Thursday night how that is going to progress, but vastly different solutions here between the NAM and the GFS as far as where our warm sector is going to set up. NAM probably forecasting a little bit less intense, a little bit less widespread convection, allowing the warm front to surge a little bit farther northward Friday afternoon. GFS probably progging a lot more convection, shunting the warm front south, and our overall severe threat a little bit farther south. So that'll be something to keep in mind as we go through the next couple of days. But here on the NAM, let's take a look at some soundings. Again, we'll probably have storms that are ongoing going into Friday morning, early Friday afternoon. And it looks like we may have a couple different regimes here. We do have quite a bit of moisture going up into the surface low here, really on both models. If you look at the GFS, we do have quite a bit of moisture going up into the surface low here, some upper 50s and 60s dew points kind of in a tongue up on the surface low. So that could mean we may see a little bit of a surface low, maybe somewhat of a pseudo cold core-esque environment up on the surface low develop. Here's our trough, colder air aloft at the center of that trough seeping in closer to the colder air aloft up there on the surface low. So we could see some storms fire up there, southern Oklahoma, southeast Oklahoma, sounding there. We'll take one there. And then this is going to be at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. And then we'll probably have this frontal boundary, dry line / cold front, Pacific front, whatever you want to call it, will be a focus for storm initiation in this environment. We'll see our storm mode. Given we have a fairly north-south orientation to this dry line / cold front, yeah, pretty decent perpendicularity among the shear vectors and the initiating boundary. So that could mean a discrete storm mode there across the eastern third of Texas or so going into Friday afternoon. So we'll take a sounding out ahead and take a look at that. And we also have to watch, of course, as always in these southern U.S. southeast events, anything coming off the Gulf in the warm advection regime out in the open warm sector. We do have a pretty broad warm sector to support the potential for open warm sector convection. Not seeing a ton of convergence boundaries out in the open warm sector. It's a little bit hard to tell. We'll see if we see anything at 850 millibars, maybe a little bit in here. So as always, we're going to have to watch for any confluence bands that set up out here in the open warm sector. But we'll take one out in here across, how about southwest Louisiana? So this is going to be up on the surface low. And that you can see that colder air aloft seeping in, pretty solid instability there, very steep laterites aloft, 2,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape, 69/64 at the surface. Low-level instability looks pretty massive. That is incredible. Almost 300 joules per kilogram of 0 to 3 kilometer cape. Very fat instability there in the low levels of the environment. So that is going to allow for probably mostly a large hail threat, but going to allow for very robust low-level updrafts. And given that we're near the surface low, near the surface boundaries, that could mean we have a lot of vorticity in place, surface spin, and that could allow for a very efficient stretching of that surface vorticity into the vertical. I mean, especially with these 3 cape values, almost 300 joules per kilogram of 0 to 3 kilometer cape. That's going to allow for very efficient tilting and stretching of any low-level vorticity into the vertical, which could aid in tornadogenesis in any storms that fire out there on the surface low. Even though low-level shear is somewhat on the weaker side, you don't need much when surface vorticity is strong and low-level cape is this intense. So we'll have to watch that as a potential area for storm development on Friday. Here we go along the dry line. Shear profiles not looking all that favorable for tornadic activity, at least on the NAM. Still solid instability, over 1,600 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape, 78/65 at the surface, a little bit deeper moisture here working its way in. 0 to 3 kilometer cape, definitely still on the large side, over 200 joules per kilogram there of 3 cape. So strong low-level instability here. which could, again, if we can get any of that vorticity at the surface to be tilted into the vertical, tilted and stretched into the vertical, should be very efficient, and that could aid in tornadogenesis despite fairly weak low-level shear. Overall, I think we may just see more of a large hail threat along the dry line, Pacific front, cold front, whatever you want to call it. Out ahead in the warm sector, a little bit stronger curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph, a little bit better veering and strengthening of the winds with height. A little bit worse instability here on the NAM, still adequate for storm development, but it is on the skinnier side, so we'll have to watch that for sure. Deeper moisture, 78/70, deeper moist layer there out in the open warm sector, so we'll have to watch that for sure as we go into Friday afternoon. Let's see the GFS. We'll take a sounding here, southern Oklahoma, right at the tip of the moisture on the surface low, one out here on the dry line / cold front. And so you can see definitely not as robust instability. This is kind of a GFS thing, usually doesn't show as robust instability as some of the other models, but definitely enough to support severe storms. Low-level shear, very, very weak. So this would mostly favor a large hail threat, except where strong surface vorticity can take place, which is probably going to be along that surface low and warm front or triple point there in southeast Oklahoma. So that's an area certainly that I'm watching. But out here along the cold front, even though we will have nice, probably a discrete supercell profile, doesn't look to be all that favorable for tornadic activity except areas east. That is interesting. Looks like the low-level jet, low-level jet looks to be displaced a little bit farther to the east compared to our surface features. Our best plume of low-level jet is out here across eastern Louisiana, southern much of Mississippi. So if we can't get any supercells to fire out here in the open warm sector, that low-level shear will be stronger out to the eastern portion of the risk area. We'll take a sounding out here just for giggles. Not sure if any storms are going to fire out here, of course, but just to see the profile. And there you go. You see a lot better turning in the hodographs, a lot better low-level shear to speak of, and that would favor a tornado threat if storms can fire that far east in the warm sector, which is certainly still up in the air. So that is going to do it for Friday afternoon. We'll continue to see that move off to the east going into Saturday morning, and the continuation of the threat into the Gulf Coast states, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, going into Saturday will be a thing with this setup. Real quick, let's take a look at some cams for tomorrow. Again, you know I don't really love looking at the cams this far out, but just for giggles here, we'll take a look at some cams for tomorrow's setup. They don't go out far enough out to let us see into Friday. But for tomorrow's setup, this is the 12Z HRRR. So we'll take a look at the HRRR going into tomorrow. We see some overnight convection there in Texas. And that is another thing as well. That could perhaps be a fly in the ointment with getting those 60s dew points, that robust moisture northward. If we see a lot of convection overnight in this area, that could thwart the northward advance of the moisture for Thursday's setup a little bit. And then the GFS might be onto something there if we can get a lot of convection out in this area overnight into the morning tomorrow. But still expecting to see enough moisture up here for a severe threat. Should be some clearing out ahead of the dry line. The HRRR not showing much here. Tries to develop a storm or two there in southwest Oklahoma. A couple on the warm front there in southern Kansas that you see, but not really robust on the HRRR. We do see some kind of towards sunset there in northwest Oklahoma. That's probably right along the triple point and warm front. And then we go into the overnight hours, and those kind of persist. A lot more convection you see firing up into the overnight hours as the forcing increases ahead of that trough coming in. Mostly a large hail threat with those storms. Could be an outside chance of a tornado or two if storms can remain surface-based. Let's take a look at the ARW model. So this is the ARW model. Just another cam that we like to use. And we see as we go forward through the evening hours, we do get some of that convection to fire up across north central Texas. Could be, again, a fly in the ointment with getting robust moisture northward. We'll have to wait and watch and see how that plays out. Not much going on. Some warm front storms here across southern Kansas on this particular model. Nothing along the dry line. So that is, again, why the dry line threat is conditional. And then overnight, we'll see an increase in convection there across much of Texas. NSSL WRF model. Last one we'll look at here before ending the video. Stuff overnight there across north central Texas. And then we see some activity. We do see some supercell activity there a little bit later than expected, but I always like to subtract a couple hours off the cams. We do see some supercells there fire in western Oklahoma along the dry line and farther to the northeast along the warm front. So something to watch there for sure. And then more activity overnight into Friday morning there across Texas. So definitely going to have to watch how much convection there is overnight in the North Texas area. Again, that could be what is keeping some of these models from getting that robust moisture into the region, and that could thwart moisture return into much of Oklahoma. We'll just have to wait and see how that plays out going into tomorrow. But overall, very interesting setup. Once again, we have a slight risk, level 2 out of 5, from southern Kansas, western Oklahoma, southward into south central Texas. All hazards threat on the table for tomorrow. Again, the greatest threat with tomorrow's activity on Thursday going to be large hail within that slight risk area. Low end threat for damaging winds and maybe a tornado or two, especially toward sunset if a storm can become robust. Especially there in western Oklahoma, north to northwest Oklahoma, along that triple point out ahead of the dry line and surface low. 2% does extend down into west central Texas, though, so we could see a brief tornado or two down that far south as well. But again, the main threat tomorrow is going to be large hail, especially as we go into the overnight hours across much of Texas, where the overall coverage of storm should increase going into Friday morning. Then our main event on Friday, large slight risk area for now, encompassing southeast Oklahoma into east Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, southern Alabama, western Florida Panhandle. Again, we will probably see some shifting in these lines once we get a better idea of how Thursday into Friday morning is going to play out. Again, if we get more convection across this area going into Friday morning, then we'll see this slight risk probably get shifted southward a little bit. If not, if we get less convection, less intense convection, then we'll probably see that moisture stream a little bit farther northward, as we saw on the NAM, and we will see a farther north extent to the severe risk. But for now, just a broad slight risk, all hazards on the table, especially in the eastern portion of the risk area where low-level shear is strongest. That's probably where, if any storms can maintain themselves out in the open warm sector, probably will be a greater tornado threat, given the low-level jet, stronger low-level shear is displaced out to the east a little bit. Back to the west along the dry line, much less low-level shear. So probably a large hail threat with supercells that can fire on the dry line. The exception is out here across southeast Oklahoma along the surface low. As that colder air aloft seeps in, that low-level instability will really skyrocket. And near any boundaries near that surface low, surface vorticity tends to increase a little bit. So if we can get any supercells to fire there along the surface low, we could see that strong low-level instability really tilt and stretch that low-level spin and vorticity into the vertical to aid in tornadogenesis there across, again, southeast Oklahoma, the Arklatex vicinity especially. Then we go into Friday or Saturday once again. A 15% risk area has been outlined for the northern Florida into Georgia vicinity. A little bit too much discrepancy to know for sure what's going to happen with that Saturday threat. We'll have to wait and see how Friday plays out. But overall, folks in the yellow shaded area there should start to prepare for severe weather that could be coming in as a continuation of the Friday activity into Saturday. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.